Coffee, big cup, and hello. Welcome back to another episode of the Gilmore Way Podcast. We've always been taught that the first rule of Fight Club is that you never speak about Fight Club. But I've already broken the rule. And it's because that's kind of what that is what we're going to be doing tonight. This episode this week, we're going to break down from seasons 1 and 2 all of the instances of fights, disagreements, arguments that we see played out on the show, trying to determine who's right, who's wrong, who has ground to stand on, who merits actually bringing up an issue to begin with, and just breaking down all of those instances that we see that sort of combativeness within the first 2 seasons. This is going to be not the only first time that we do Fight Club. There will probably be 3 or 4 iterations of Fight Club for seasons 1 and 2, then for seasons 3 and 4, for 5 and 6, and then for 7 and the revival. So come back for those 2, but right now, again, we're just going to focus on the fighting within 1 and 2.
Yeah, you really can't fit all of the contention into a single 90-minute episode or less. So this is going to be at least a 4-parter. So
yeah, I mean, every Friday night dinner pretty much has contention. So there's no way we could squeeze it into one. So exactly. We're just going to focus in on that.
Yeah, we're going to focus in on some of the best ones, but I feel like seasons 1 and 2 don't even have the best ones. No, so I feel like it's going to be like, this is good, and the hitters are going to come in a few more seasons. Like in season 3, we literally have a fist fight breakout. So it's gonna get spicier as we continue on throughout the season. So I'm very excited for that. But before we properly get started, it's your weekly reminder, if you could please do all the YouTube things. We would be ever so grateful if you would like, share, subscribe, turn on notifications, leave us comments, join us in the chat and tell us your thoughts, because we love that kind of stuff. So let's get the conversation started. Why don't you start with our first synopsis?
I will do that. We're going to kick this off with episode 19 of season 2, which is Teach Me Tonight. And Lorelai is excited to find out that movie night in the square is back again. But when she discovers that they will be showing The Yearling again, she gives Taylor grief, and he allows her to pick the movie, but only from a certain selection, and she ends up going with The Yearling anyway. But Kirk comes in clutch with a pre-movie short film he made, which is amazing. When Luke finds out that Jess isn't doing well at school, he enlists Rory's help as a tutor because he thinks Jess will respect her. While they're studying, Jess suggests that they go out for ice cream, and while they're driving around, they get into an accident. Rory breaks her arm, and when Lorelai finds out, she explodes at Luke and tells him to go to hell. Despite what happened the last time he was in town, Christopher shows up after Lorelai calls him to tell him what went on. Jess leaves town without even a goodbye.
Yep. Great episode.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Season 2, episode 20 is Help Wanted. Richard is going full steam ahead with setting up the Gilmore Group, his new international insurance consulting business. But when his secretary from Gurman Driscoll won't come with him because he can't match her salary, Lorelai steps in to help him set up the office and conduct interviews to find a Margie for the new millennium. But Richard finds he likes working with Lorelai and drags his feet in finding a new secretary in order to keep her around longer. Rory has to tell Dean, who was visiting his grandparents in Chicago at the time of the accident, about what happened that night with Jess. He's angry as he reads the letter she wrote explaining it, but forgives her and moves on once he finds out that Jess has left town, presumably for good. Emily throws a launch party for Richard's new business and finds out about the accident by seeing Rory in a cast. Rory is also upset with everyone for assuming that Jess was entirely responsible for the accident, even though it was her idea to keep driving around after they got ice cream, acting as though she was just a fawning little girl following him everywhere who had no agency or responsibility in the matter, while also painting Jess as a horrible person. Yeah, so I thought this would be a great time to talk about the fights of the first 2 seasons, both because we're approaching the end of season 2 and because one of the best fights of the first 2 seasons happens in Teach Me Tonight between Lorelai and Luke. And we're going to talk about that one closer to the end of the episode. So definitely make sure you stick around for the whole thing. But I would like to start a little bit earlier in the show and go back to the pilot. And also episode 9, Rory's Dance. So I want to talk a little bit about those kind of two fights between Emily and Lorelai, that they have a lot of similar themes to them, a lot of similar resentments bubbling to the surface, and they parallel each other quite nicely. And so I wanted to start with those ones because I think, they're really emblematic of what a lot of the show rests on. So what do you think of those two fights? And is there anything about them that like really speaks to you, or do you have any strong opinions about, again, who's right, who's wrong, who's got the ground to stand on?
I mean, I will give it to Lorelai and not so much Emily as a grandparent, but like I understand the concern. But Lorelai has ground to stand on. Your daughter didn't come home. Stays out all night with a boy. Just doesn't even give you a phone call or the courtesy to let you know what's going on. Not that would have mattered, because I'm sure Lorelai would have still just been like, I think you need to come home. But a wake-up call from Miss Patty saying that she walked into the studio at 5 a.m. and just found them sleeping together, not knowing what could have happened. I understand where Lorelai is coming from, where you're just concerned for your child. I mean, that's your only kid. So, of course, you're going to be worried when you wake up in the morning and your kid's not there, and you have your mother, but Emily, of all mothers, just coming at you saying, like, Rory's not here. What's going on? So Lorelai was confronted twofold with, I don't need to deal with this nonsense of my daughter not coming home right now, but I also didn't need to deal with this nonsense of Emily Gilmore freaking out in my face and just hounding me about it. So it was an honest, like, we see as the audience that it's an honest mistake, that that Rory did not intend to stay out all night. They honestly just fell asleep. Nothing actually happened, but it is still behavior from a 16-year-old where if I was a parent, I would just be like, that's not okay. I can't let that fly. That's not going to stand in this household. And we need to talk about this and confront it, because this cannot continue to happen. Rory was defensive because, again, her argument was just like, well, nothing happened and you should trust me more. But I think Lorelai is right in saying, well, this isn't about trust fully necessarily. This is just about the fact that I think for Lorelai, it was a direct reflection of everything that she did to Emily as a teenager. And even though Lorelai, just went about living that way as with Emily, and was just like, oh, well, it is what it is. I don't think she wants to see Rory going down the same path that she did and making the same mistakes that she did. And she knee-jerks reacts, and she's like, you're going on the pill. There's no way that you're getting pregnant. I'm not letting that happen. There was just a lot coming into play there, but I think Lorelai was right to be concerned as a parent, was right to, I mean, she came down on her, but I think she had a right to do so. Like, it's a scary thing when your kid doesn't come home at night and isn't in their bed in the morning. And I think the response that we get from Emily just, again, coincides with that, where Emily is just flashing back to all the times when Lorelai pulled stunts and BS like this. And it's just a very harsh flashback that's right in her face in that moment that she doesn't want for her granddaughter either. So I will give it to Lorelai and Emily for being concerned and for being mad. I think they had every right to be upset.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. Scary when your kid doesn't come home, period. Just as a parent, the anxiety was real for both of them, for different reasons, obviously. But it really does speak to, especially Emily, kind of having flashbacks of Lorelai's behavior and what ended up happening there. And, obviously her pregnancy was accidental. So even an accident can lead to a whole cascading effect. But I also find it interesting that this fight really does parallel that one from the first episode. We start out in the kitchen in the pilot with Emily and Lorelai yelling at each other about her treatment that evening, and how, Richard's bringing up Christopher and how they were always shut out. And Lorelai kind of having to defend the fact that, you know, she's like, I am living a lovely life right now, and I did it on my own without any help from anyone. And so then later we get Emily coming into Lorelai's house, the life she had built, the lovely life, and seeing that there's a parallel between Lorelai and Rory, and just starting to freak out and starting to sort of like project maybe her own feelings of failure about Lorelai's uncontrollable nature, and potentially thinking that Rory is going to go down a very similar path. And I don't really think it's justified, because Lorelai and Rory are not the same person. More on that in a few weeks. But it's so, like, the two fights are so similar if you sort of like read them through or watch them back to back. You can really see that it's like it's the same wounds being opened in both of them, and it shows that like nobody is over what happened 16 years ago. So, and I just think that especially the one in the pilot episode was so well used, narratively speaking, in that episode to sort of like end off the episode or near the end of the episode. I think it really sums up the conflict in their relationship in one beautifully written and acted scene. And it carries through not only the first season, but like through other moments of their conflict as well. But it's such a perfect stage to set, to use an argument like that as sort of like your foundation in the pilot. So I thought that was really cool.
Mm-hmm. I think we would agree that Lorelai had ground to stand on. What do you think about Emily's reaction to all of that?
I think in this particular instance, Lorelai was more right than Emily both times. She's right that she gets too much flack from them. Even in the first fight, she says, you know, so what's it going to be? Like, am I going to come over here every week and you're just going to attack me? Because she really feels that. And then Emily comes into her house and attacks her over something that's not her fault, and starts casting aspersions onto her parenting skills because of an accident. Well, the audience knows it's an accident, but they don't know that yet. And so I think Emily is being a little too overly judgmental and is jumping to conclusions that are unfounded based on what everyone knows to be true about Rory and the head on her shoulders, how conscientious she is in general at this point. I mean, there are still some areas where she lacks maturity, but at least she's not a wild child who's going to go out all night and use drugs and all kinds of things that might screw her up a little bit. And the one thing I will kind of give Emily some points on is in the pilot episode fight, where they're talking about the fact that Lorelai's too proud. At least Emily is calling her out on it. Like, you know, we were here to support you and help you and protect you. And think of where you would be if you were able to accept that help and that support. Like, you think you live a lovely life right now, but just think about where you both would be if you had just accepted a fraction of our love and our support. But on the other hand, I know that her version of love and support isn't what Lorelai wanted or needed. So it's hard to say, but she is right about Lorelai's pride. So.
Mm-hmm. Let's backtrack to one of the first fights that we get in season 1. The fight between Lorelai and Rory over her admission to Chilton, and then her instantly being like, well, actually, I don't think I want to go. And we know why. It stems from Dean coming into the picture and interest in a boy, and all of a sudden I don't want to leave Stars Hollow High because there's, you know, man candy there. But what do you think about that whole fight and how that plays out, especially with Lorelai not having the context for why Rory is saying what she's saying, but then the fight, even after she gains the context and is still just like, you are going anyway tomorrow morning, you will be there. What do you think about that whole spiel?
Again, the pilot using not only like a funny but a poignant fight to illustrate the dynamic between these women, because like, it's funny. I love when they're outside of Miss Patty's and Rory just sort of walks away in a huff, and she's like, oh, you're gonna have to turn into friggin' Flojo to get away from me. And then, of course, we have the iconic, does he have a motorcycle? Because if you're gonna throw your life away, he better have a motorcycle. It's funny. And Lorelai is trying to inject her, her trademark humor into it because she's the cool mom. But speaking of that, this is when we find out that they have a democracy in that household, and that this is kind of the first time that a major conflict like this has arisen between them, and that Lorelai doesn't play the mom card very often. So it really tells us something about how they have resolved conflict in the past, and how that might be changing now as Rory is starting to really grow up and come into her own, and has to start making more difficult choices, and has to start making some calls about her life path, and how Lorelai feels about that. Because, obviously there's an intrinsic motivation for Rory to want to go to Harvard, but as things get more complicated, her attention might start to waver, and Lorelai wants to make sure she stays on that path, and decides in this moment that sort of using that force and playing that card is the right call. And it doesn't really impact Rory and her decision until Rory overhears that fight in the kitchen. And that's when she starts to get it, starts to understand exactly what Lorelai has had to do to make this happen for her. And she starts to appreciate the sacrifices and appreciate that she needs to stick on this path because it's the right thing to do, and that Dean will still be there. So that's a really good one. What do you think about it?
I agree with everything that you just said. This is this is Rory's first crush. This is the first time that we know of that she's really had significant interest in a guy. So, of course, she's just going to be, starry-eyed and naive and just be like, he's the greatest thing ever. And I just want to go to school where he's going to school. And I'm going to, not that she was in the mindset of like, I'm ready to like give up all my dreams and throw away my education. But I can see the blinders. Well, I can understand the blinders that she had on in that moment of just thinking like, if I go to Chilton, it's less time that I get to spend with Dean. And I think Lorelai was good in making sure that she wasn't throwing away an educational opportunity. But I think over the course of the next few days, I think Rory was able to rationalize for herself that, like, I can still have Chilton. It doesn't mean I'm going to, like what you said, I'm not going to see Dean any less necessarily. Because if that's a guy that I want to pursue, and if he is really interested in me, we will find a way to make that work. And we both live in this really small town anyway, so we will have opportunity to see each other. But I can have Chilton and have Dean too. It doesn't need to be one or the other.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of not needing to be one or the other, I'd like to jump us ahead a little bit. Well, sort of middling. I guess it's not so much ahead because we've talked about episode 9 already. But in Kill Me Now, we have another really interesting fight between Lorelai and Rory, where Rory actually has a good time at the country club with Richard playing golf. I mean, golf's not her sport.
Is it anybody?
Golf. Is it anybody? Yeah, we both hate it. So we'll just hold our tongue, I guess, on all the things that are wrong with golf for the sake of
good
this.
walk spoiled.
Indeed. She wasn't wrong about that. But it's interesting because it's the first glimpse we get into Rory's enjoyment of the life that Lorelai left behind. And it really sparked some controversy. So what's your take on that scene where they're sitting on their porch and Lorelai's freaking out about it? And it's like, you totally stole my sweater. Your boobs are totally bigger than mine.
Yeah. I mean, obviously we both know that wasn't really what that fight was about. I think it was just at that point, we were still like, this was still an introduction to Lorelai and mainly Rory starting to have regular contact with her grandparents and having them be incorporated into her life in that way and be a regular part of her week with Friday night dinner and other things that may come up. And for the first 15 to 16 years of Rory's life, Lorelai has been her worldview. That's been her center. That's been her focus. And I think Lorelai is just also dealing with even if she doesn't want to admit it, a lot of jealousy where it's like, you know, I wanted us to be this insular family unit. Like, you know, I had issue with my grandparents. I thought they were never going to have to be a part of my life because I thought I could always be so sure that I could financially get us by without having to revert back to that. So I think there's a lot coming to the forefront there. But I think it's just Lorelai having to reckon with, you know, Rory may and is starting to get close to Emily and Richard. And I hate that because I don't want her to get close to them because I just wanted it to be like us against the world. And I didn't want to have to lean on them. And now she's getting close to them. And I think in Lorelai's mind, it's taking Rory away from her.
Yeah. It's the first time that she realizes that Rory is her own person, I think, which is sad because she's 16 now, or almost 16. Again, as I mentioned when talking about the pilot, Rory is starting to make her own decisions and is starting to individuate from her mom. And it's a tough transition for Lorelai to reckon with that. So it's not one of her finest moments when she screams at her own daughter that her larger chest is stretching out all of her sweaters. So again, it really shows how bad Lorelai is at maybe being objective sometimes when it comes to Rory, and also how poorly she can sometimes handle her emotions when it comes to conflict. And there will be more on that later, believe me, when we get to the car crash. We'll get into this a little bit more, but it's just that first sort of like window into the fact that, you know, she looks like a grown up and she's a mom, but she still has a lot of growing up to do.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of starry-eyed naivety and immaturity,
I think I know where you're going with this, which is where I was.
Where do you think of? What?
Nope. I want to see if I'm right. Nope.
I want to see if you could read my mind. Where are we going next?
Give me a little more to work with, and then I'll take a guess.
It's about a boy or a man, I guess. Yet another fight between Lorelai and Rory that centers on a man in their life.
I was going elsewhere, but so go on.
All right. Well, I guess I've been evicted from your brain, or vice versa. But anyway, Paris is burning. The stairwell fight. Paris has just seen Lorelai and Max kissing in his classroom and has told everybody. And Rory finds out that Lorelai has embarrassed her now. And what I think is really interesting about this fight in particular is the fact that they bring up sort of like the Gilmore dating rules. And they talk about how Lorelai has sort of set it up that Lorelai never really knows about her dating life because it has the possibility of destabilizing her and causing her to get attached to people that may not be in her life long enough. And, you know, Lorelai defends this tooth and nail, saying, you know, these rules are the reason that we're doing so great right now. And, this is why you're going to get into Harvard. Don't dismiss my rules. And once again, Lorelai, why do I keep doing this? Rory, technically her name's Lorelai.
I do it all the time. I did it 3 times already this episode.
I know, and I caught it too, and I was like, oh, we both do it. Anyway, Rory says that, you know, I'm not a child anymore, and maybe we need to rethink these rules. And we also kind of touched on this when we talked about Lorelai and Max and how that impacted Rory as well. But I think this particular fight, which is just kind of juvenile and very public, like someone could walk into that stairwell at any moment. What are you doing? But yeah, I like Rory's point about like maybe it's time to rethink these rules. So did you have any particular take on their dynamic in that moment when it comes to, you know, Rory pushing back on the rules?
Yeah, I don't think she's wrong. I don't think Rory has, again, ground to stand on here. You're 16. You're still a child. Your mother is an adult. Um, she is fully capable and warranted and able to make her own decisions on who she's going to kiss, where she's going to kiss them. Granted, I will agree that uh, you know, making out with, your English teacher on school property is not going to do Rory any favors, and it's not going to do the situation any favors. And I also think, just in general, that is largely inappropriate on Max's part specifically. But I'm just gonna look at the two things separately. Is it wrong to do that on school property where Rory's classmates can see, and it will just haunt her and follow her down the hallways for the rest of her Chilton career? Absolutely, yes. And Rory had to contend with that up until she graduated in one way or another. However, Lorelai, as an adult, has the right to date whomever she pleases, to get involved with whomever she pleases. She should have taken it outside of the schoolyard. Um, and if you want to pursue Max, that's your right, but you need to do it outside of school hours. Just go do the whole normal coffee thing or dinner thing. And, maybe there's a coffee shop aside from, across the street from where you normally go for your night classes for business education. All that's fine. It just needed to happen outside of Chilton. So I flag her for making out and kissing him, and having that be seen on school property, but she was always well within her rights to pursue Max, I think, if she wanted to, in a healthy, and again, I can't emphasize this enough, outside of school hours and property, regard.
Yeah, I tend to agree that Lorelai is free to date whomever she pleases. But I think that, doing it on school property was bad. And it circles back to her immaturity and her inability to communicate, because they wouldn't have been in this situation in the first place if Lorelai was able to communicate her feelings to Max in a more appropriate manner / venue, which she was just unable to do. She had to come to Parents' Day and had to face Max, and just the fact that she had kind of been bottling things up made it such that it was almost impossible for it not to sort of spill out into a fight with him. And so that bit was unnecessary. And so then maybe they could have controlled their emotions a little better and controlled the situation a little better and saved it for their next date. So there's that aspect of it. And then I was sort of rewatching this before we recorded this, and I don't know, I'm wondering too about the rules specific. Are her rules the reason they're doing so great in their lives? Should she be attributing their success and Rory's academic success, the strength of their relationship, all to this insularity that she's created for themselves? Part of me thinks yes, and part of me thinks no. I think that overall their insularity is maybe not the best for the both of them, but I also think that when Rory is young, you have to keep things age appropriate, for one, and you do have to consider your daughter's feelings when it comes to dating other people, because I think we get an example of what happens when parents are too concerned with dating and maybe their kids are too much a part of that dynamic with Liz and Jess, because Liz was kind of always picking her relationships over him and focusing more on that than her own son. And so in a way, I think maybe it is part of the reason that Lorelai and Rory have been relatively conflict free and have been able to focus on themselves and the strength of their own relationship. But what do you think?
I would agree. There's a little column A, there's a little column B. I think the insularity is unhealthy, and we've talked about why that is a lot already, and I'm sure we'll touch on that a little bit more. But I don't think you can fully equate the success of what they have going on as a mother-daughter pairing solely to those rules. Because it's a different scenario, but I think, like, look at Luke trying to institute rules with Jess and how that didn't work. And you could say, like, Jess is not Rory, but that's the point. Like, Rory was a good kid. She always was a good kid, respectful, behaved well, was mindful of her mother, was studious, didn't get into trouble. So it was going to be easy for them to have that rapport and for her to abide by those rules because Rory had a good head on her shoulders. And you could say that's because, like, Lorelai raised her well, but I don't want to discredit Rory's individuality there with saying that she was just an overall well-rounded and respectful human being. Because you can have great parents and have a child that still just falls into trouble like that. Or you can have situations of just really neglectful and bad parents, but have a child who is trying to do the best for themselves and who is respectful and really a good person nonetheless. So I don't think you can equate it to the rules that Lorelai was perpetuating and establishing for the household. I think it was a part of it, but I think it also just boiled down to the fact that Rory was just a good kid. So Lorelai never really needed to worry about her or worry about discipline, even as much as, like, your average American adolescent and teenager. She got really lucky with her.
Yeah. I almost wonder if it's like a false attribution of, like, obviously it was the thing that I did that was brilliant and perfect, and this is why things have gone so well for us. I think it might just be a bit of an exaggeration on her part, but I find it interesting that it is yet another thing that they're pushing each other on and negotiating the boundaries of that bit of the relationship. So it does move things forward for them a little bit, because after this point, Rory is able to bond with Max a little bit, and obviously things don't end up where they thought they were going to be. She thought he was going to be her stepfather, but at least it was a step in the right direction for them starting to let someone else in a little bit more. So it was something.
Yep.
But
I would agree. Okay. Go ahead.
Do you have anything else on this, or
nope? I was going to move us on to another fight that is juicy for me, but if you want to, pinpoint this elsewhere,
you pick this one.
Okay. I want us to move on and talk about the fight with Emily and Richard and Rory's present, but also Strobe and Francine and Christopher being there, and how they just all get at each other and come to a head with one another over failed livelihoods, diminished futures, how they inadvertently, but not inadvertently, blame Rory for it, and just that whole fight when the Haydens come to dinner at the Gilmores.
I love that fight. I love it. I love it. I love it. Strobe is a jerk. That's the gentlest way I can put it without getting this video taken down by YouTube. I have a lot more words that are not so nice for Strobe. He's another one of those people on the show who can't see his own role in what's happened in his son's life. He assumes that Lorelai is the problem. And, Chris would have been fine. Chris would have gone to Princeton were it not for this. But your daughter ruined my son's life. He's just displacing and projecting Christopher's perceived failures onto someone else, because it couldn't possibly be his parenting, or, the way that Chris wants to rebel, or the fact that Chris may not be cut out for an Ivy League institution where the rigor is that high. It's just an excuse for him to blame someone else. And so he just comes in hot and tries to take it out on Lorelai. I was recently listening to Scott's podcast where they talk about Written in the Stars.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me think of Paris's quote from that episode when Asher dies. And she's like, "No, Rory, this great man was not taken down by my vagina." And it's the same thing with Chris. His life was not ruined by the fact that he got some tail when he was 16. You know, it was Lorelai's decision to keep the baby. She was the one who took the primary responsibility. She would not have prevented Chris from going. That was his stuff. That was his inability to get his stuff together and keep it together and stay on the path. And I don't blame him. Like, if that wasn't the lifestyle that he wanted or the path that he wanted, he shouldn't have been forced to take it. This is a very common theme in the show with Lorelai, with Rory, with Christopher, with Logan, with Jess. All of them are sort of told what path to be on, and every single one of them tries to reject it at some point. So it's just yet another one of those moments that goes to show that if parents try to be too controlling and they can't be objective about maybe their own role in it, that it's just not going to go well for anyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I've said this before, but I want to bring it up again. Richard has a very interesting love language with how he shows Lorelai and Rory, but Lorelai specifically, that he does genuinely love her and care about her. He never outrightly says it. He's very reticent to show it. But you could tell here that this is a man that loves his daughter. And I'll get to like the study part of it afterwards with that conversation about why he did it. But he didn't have to defend Lorelai necessarily in the way that he did. And I don't even think Lorelai was expecting it because of the gratitude that she shows after. And she goes to him and it's just like, "Thank you, Dad. Like, thank you for sticking up for me and for doing that." But he defended his daughter and he defended Rory, but it was a major defense of Lorelai in saying like, "Listen, stroke, Francine, GTFO, okay? This was a mistake that was made collectively by Lorelai and Christopher. It was not solely Lorelai's doing. So do not come up into my household and say that Christopher's life was ruined solely because of my daughter. This was consensual sex. It resulted in a child. It was always going to be like it was Lorelai. Lorelai made the decision to keep the baby. It didn't alter Christopher's life. If he had still wanted to go to school, he still could have. He never was financially responsible for Rory. He never had to pay child support that we know of. His life was not altered. And so for Strobe to waltz in and say he didn't get to Princeton and his life was derailed because of Lorelai is an extreme falsehood. And so I love Richard sticking up for her and just saying, "How dare you come into my house and insult my daughter in that way? Get out, because I'm not going to stand for it, and I'm not going to listen to you say that it was solely her fault and then call my daughter like a mistake and a travesty that just was the end all be all to Christopher's life." So kudos, endless kudos to Richard for that. And we get the follow-up of the study scene where Richard is, saying to Lorelai, "Well, why do you think I did it?" "Because I had to uphold the Gilmore name, because I wasn't going to let someone come into my house and diminish the family name in that way." I think there's maybe the most minimal truth to that, because I do think he's a very prideful person in that way. But I think that was also just him again, like Richard is not the kind of person to like emote and to say like, "I did it because I love you and because you're my daughter and you mean a lot to me." Like those words were never going to come out of his mouth. So I think he just needed to like cover his own tracks and say like, "It's because I was, concerned about the family name." But I think anyone who's watching that scene knows it's like, because you love your daughter, dude, and you showed it, and we get it, and I'm here for it.
Yeah, we can tell he loves her. Unfortunately, the fight doesn't really resolve very well, because Lorelai even says to him in the study, like, so that's it? Like, I just leave and nothing's resolved? And he's like, I'm too tired for this, Lorelai. Like, go away. But by the next episode, he is allowing her to sneak out when Chase Bradford is there and being annoying, and he's even recognizing how odious this guy is. He's like, just run, save yourself. But I think that Richard, I don't know if he had, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, I don't know if he had a duty to defend his daughter so much. But, like, also maybe he did, because frankly, they act like it was the end of the damn world that Lorelai had a child. And while it's not an easy thing for a teenager to have a child, and it's certainly not an ideal situation, you know, they just acted like it was a travesty on the highest level. I think there's maybe a lack of perspective, and they let it cloud their judgment that it was so socially unacceptable for this to happen, and the fact that the kids didn't go along with the plan to get married and live with them and join the business and all of those kinds of things. But Lorelai didn't deserve the verbal abuse coming from Strobe. And so, yeah, Richard should have defended her. And the fact that he almost came to blows with Strobe was actually kind of a fitting response, I think, to just the level of vitriol that Strobe was spitting in that moment, because it was not deserved for either of them. Like, yeah, it was not the greatest moment in their lives. I'm sure that maybe they have some regrets about it somewhere along the line, but again, it's your family member, and it's not like they committed some sort of atrocity. It was an unplanned pregnancy. Lorelai doesn't deserve to have all of that placed on her. And especially when you see the result is such a wonderful person as Rory, or at least in their eyes, she's wonderful. It's completely necessary, I think, for Richard to say, absolutely, yeah, you're not leaving, I'm kicking you out. So there's that. But yeah, I don't love the follow-up scene in the study where he's just like, it's not about Lorelai or her righteousness in this moment, or, you know, her lack of fault. He's just still too hurt by the whole situation all these years later, and he has no perspective or growth or change of heart on the matter. And, you know, Lorelai comes in and tries to be vulnerable with him and says, you know, like, I'm unbelievably touched and grateful for defending me like that. I know it's hard for you, but he has to turn around and be a jerk about it and say, why do you think I did it? It was like, you don't need to be protected. You've made it clear that you can look after yourself. You don't need anything from anyone. I did it because a member of my family was being attacked. The Gilmore name was being attacked, which is beside the point. Like, your ideas of family loyalty are really messed up. And, you know, it shouldn't be about that. It should be about Lorelai's feelings and her culpability in the matter and the bigger picture. But you're too stubborn and proud. Gee, I wonder where Lorelai got it. To see that she's a human being who was being attacked and didn't deserve it. Your family name didn't have its feelings hurt. Your daughter did.
I agree with all of that. I couldn't have said it better myself.
Any other thoughts about...
No, I think that's it. Where to next on the fight train?
That damn Donna Reed.
I know it.
Yeah. Rory and Dean, and Dean's snippy comment about, you know, all the repressed housewives buying dinner for their husbands on Thursday afternoons. I know you love this episode, so why don't you lead us off with some thoughts about Dean's anti-feminist jokes?
I love this episode. It's my absolute favorite. Oh boy. Dean. First off, just do better.
Well, he's 16. He hasn't taken a gender studies class yet.
Do better.
Neither have I.
again, like, it's hard because you make an excellent point. He and Rory are still both so young and naive. And Dean was raised in a household, it seems, where this is what he saw modeled by his mom and his dad, where mom stays at home, takes care of the kids, does all of the household cleaning, the household chores, makes dinner so that it's ready for the kids and the husband when they're home at night. You know, dad goes to work and is the breadwinner. Um, so when that is what Dean has known, I can understand why he says, well, what's really wrong with that? Because my parents have a very happy and successful marriage and they've done well living their lives that way. So what's the issue? And Rory, obviously, without a father figure being actively present, has had a very different upbringing, is going to have a very different mindset and say, well, shouldn't there be a little bit more equality within the household? Like, why does the woman always have to fall into these gender stereotypes and these roles and subject herself to being responsible for all of these things? So I can see how they both have differing views. And so in that sense, and we've talked about this too, with why this episode was good, but why also, and I know in your mind this is one of your least favorites of episode 1, because it's like, well, what were you trying to do here other than maybe just like another filler or fluffy one? But you spent so much time just trying to just break down all of these notions of how Donna Reed is not something to idealize, and that sort of like nuclear household with gender specified responsibilities are not something that we should strive for or aspire to. Like, I get it, Amy, you kind of beat the horse dead there just a little bit. But it's also good that, like, it's good that she did it, but maybe like you could have scaled it back a little bit. I don't know. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think this one isn't as progressively feminist as it likes to make itself out to be, unfortunately. And part of that is the resolution of the fight that involves Rory being the one to, it seems like she did all the work to research the show and to formulate an opinion that isn't just something Lorelai spouted out. I mean, kind of good on Dean for getting her to do that. Once again, just another example of Rory growing up and starting to formulate opinions that are more complex. And yeah, so she's the one who looks up Donna Stone and figures out that she's one of the first television producers, first female television producers, rather, and that she was kind of groundbreaking in her own way, even if her show perpetuated that idea of the perfect little housewife. And Rory's apology to Dean was just a little too far, I think. I'm glad that Dean was sort of like, look, just because I think it's a nice idea doesn't mean I expect that of you. I like you the way you are. I'm not saying you have to change for me. I was just expressing that I thought it was kind of nice. But, this is their first fight. It's the first time we really see Rory fighting with someone who's not her mom or Lane.
Mm-hmm.
And being in a romantic relationship with Dean adds another layer of interest to what's going on here. I think she maybe not forgave him too easily, because he didn't do anything that terrible, but he was immature in his response with like the joke that he made about the housewives shopping for the dinner. And Rory made a good point that a lot of it came down to choice, and his mom had a choice but the other women didn't. I don't know. I think it just feels a little forced for two 16-year-olds to be having a conversation about feminism in the middle of the street in Stars Hollow, and then for Rory to come out of it wearing a gingham dress. Again, part of the reason why this is not one of my favorite episodes. But at least Dean pushed her on something. And even if he was lacking nuance in his own position because of his limited worldview, at least he got Rory to expand hers. And they found a way to rectify things. But it's the whole thing at Babette's house was just weird. And I don't even have the words for it because it just feels icky. But any other thoughts on the resolution to that one?
No, I mean, again, I think you summed it up very well. I know we'll get back to this issue a lot when we have our feminist and feminism episode, so I'll save a lot of the thoughts for then. But I do want to push us forward a little bit now into season 2 and talk about, we're going to stick with Dean and Rory, but not so much about feminism, but just about how they contend with one another over Rory and her needing to pursue Harvard more and do extracurriculars on the weekend, and how Dean feels that's taking away from their relationship with one another, how maybe she's not spending enough time with him and that he's not satisfied with that. And so there are fights over that. What do you think about all of that?
Yeah, I love Hammers and Veils as an episode on the whole. And I'm with Rory on this one. I think Dean was being a little bit too, like, I don't want to say clingy. He wasn't really clingy, but he's always said that he supports Rory in her dream of going to Harvard. And then in this moment, all of a sudden, when she says that she has something important to do when it comes to preparing for Harvard, he's like, but I wanted to hang out and watch Barbarella with you. Like, summer is the time to kick back and relax. I'm like, well, maybe for you, but if you're trying to go to an Ivy League institution, it takes more than that. And sometimes you need to understand that you can't be Rory's only priority. I know you just got back together, but her life is bigger than just you, and she has goals and dreams that sometimes will require her attention, and you sometimes just need to roll with that and listen to her and say, okay, I support you. I am a little disappointed that I don't get to spend more time with you today, but I understand how important this is, and I will see you when things calm down and you've made some progress on what you need to do. Let me know if there's anything I can do, or like call me if you change your mind or if you burn out on this, and then we can hang out. I mean, granted, 17-year-old boy, can't really expect that from him. That's a pretty mature response for even a grown man to have, frankly, when it comes to, or a grown person of any sort. I mean, it's not exclusively just men that happens to, but he could have handled it a little more gracefully. Granted, Rory was a little frantic, so he was probably just taken aback and a little miffed that she changed the plan last minute. But yeah, what do you think about it? Or like, do you have any thoughts about the fight itself or the resolution to this one that jumped out at you?
Yeah, but I mean, it's not the first instance of Rory ignoring a friend or a partner or a person in her life for something that she deems more important. I don't want to say that she's fair weathered, because I feel like that, and like, it just, that whole definition of that means that you're cognizant necessarily, I think, sometimes of what you're doing, and that you're choosing the more desirable thing, and you know that you're doing it. But it was the same sort of gripe that Lane had with Rory, where she was like, you're spending so much time with Dean and everything is about him, and every time that we're hanging out, all you do is talk about him, and you're not listening to any of my problems. And I feel like our friendship is suffering for it. And I want us to getting to like talk about that fight too, and their disagreements and their differences. And it's a different sort of context here, but I can understand where Dean is coming from with a similar sort of grievance, where he's like, everything for you right now is about Harvard and talking about Harvard and your extracurriculars and what it's going to take to get you there. And Dean understands that that's important to her. I don't think he's entirely dismissive of it or crapping on it in any way. I think he's just feeling sidelined a lot of the like times in the way that Lane was, where he's like, this is important to you, and I get that, and I support that as your boyfriend and as a person in your life. Like, I want that for you. But, I'm still here. And so I want to be able to spend time with you and talk to you and have conversations that maybe aren't always about school and Harvard. Like, let's talk about other things and other interests and other topics too. So I can understand why he felt that way. And again, just it's not the first time that Rory has done it to somebody in her life. She did it with Lane too. She can make it very much about herself and what's going on in her life.
Yeah, I tend to agree with all of that. I guess I'll just add that I think the resolution is pretty good and pretty mature for two 17-year-olds because they both acknowledge some fault in the end. Like once they kind of have a chance to go away and think about it and let the emotion subside a little bit and think about it more rationally, they demonstrate a better understanding of each other's feelings than you might expect. And it kind of feels like a first for both of them to like really acknowledge that. And Rory recognizes that she might freak out like this again as Harvard draws closer because things are going to start getting harder and the pressure is just increasing. And Dean also lets Rory know that he understands that she's under pressure and that he can't fully empathize with it because nobody else is putting that pressure on him, including himself. So that was a really emotionally intelligent moment for him. And I think, it was a moment of growth that showed some real promise for Dean that was roundly flushed down the toilet once a certain someone came in and they had to make Dean worse again.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I agree. Yeah. I want to move us along because, as always, we're already over the hour mark, which is par for the course for us, but I don't want us to be here all night talking about Fight Club because we will have, again, multiple iterations of this. But how do you feel just quickly about Lane and Rory and their fights over Rich Blumenfeld, Lane feeling like Rory wasn't being present in the friendship, not being there for her, making it all about her, not listening to what she had going on, and how their friendship dynamic suffered a bit early on?
I mean, we did go into some pretty solid detail about this in our female friendship episode, so I won't harp on it here for the interest of getting on to like the really juicy stuff that comes up when the aforementioned someone comes in. But yeah, I think Rory was young and naive, and I mean, Chilton kind of later will accuse her of maybe subpar socialization skills, and I think maybe her issues with Lane is a bit emblematic of that because Lane has been her bestie their whole lives, basically since kindergarten. And so she doesn't have to split her attention so much all the time. Her attention really is just on Lorelai and Lane and whatever homework she happens to have, which she can manage easily because public school is easy for her. And so when she finally gets a boyfriend and starts in school, her life just got infinitely more busy and more complicated. And Lane feels like the one who gets shunted in that situation. And their fight when Rory's not really being present for her, I think was a good thing for her. It was good that Lane called her out on it a little bit. I think Lane was maybe being a little immature in that moment too. Go back to the previous episode on female friendship for my fuller thoughts on that. But in the end, it was a good step forward for Rory because she did have to realize that sometimes she can get a little up in her own stuff and that sometimes she needs to be able to pull herself back out of it and focus on people who need her.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I'm not going to harp on this because, like you said, we've already talked about it a lot. So I don't think there's too much more that we need to extrapolate on. What other juicy things do you want us to get to?
The juiciest of the juice. Let's talk about Lorelai and Luke after Jess gets to town.
Mm-hmm.
So in Nick and Nora, Sid and Nancy, when Lorelai confronts Jess on the porch about drinking the beer, and he's giving her lip about how, like, he doesn't really want to be there, and she tries to give him a whole pep talk of Luke is very special. If you just give him a chance and let him in, like, this could be really good for you. And he's like, either, I can't even remember the whole thing, but he's like, you're probably getting some, aren't you?
Yeah.
And so then
Yeah.
obviously Lorelai comes in and tells Luke, that kid is more screwed up than you think. And, I'm just trying to talk to him, and he practices his Breakfast Club audition on me. And so she starts criticizing Luke and being like, I think you're way in over your head here. I'm trying to help you. I know a little more than you do because at least I have a kid. And then Luke comes in and is like defensive about the fact that maybe he's not ready to take on such a troubled kid. Maybe he underestimated exactly how bad this is. And he feels like he needs to protect himself a little bit, like protect his ego from Lorelai's criticisms. And then he takes a cheap shot at her by saying, like, you basically just got lucky with Rory, and you did get pregnant at 16. That doesn't show the greatest decision-making skills. And so this is, where the title of the episode comes from, where it's like, this wasn't Nick and Nora, this was Sid and Nancy. Like, she thinks this was a pretty bad fight for them. It's one of the first times they've really had it out verbally like this. Mm-hmm. So Jess comes to town and just screws everything up. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. Quite the proclivity for just random theft of the most obscure objects. I will say I did enjoy how much he can piss Taylor off, especially with like the crime scene set up.
I love that
outside
moment.
And I love how, like, even I love that moment where he and Rory are talking, and at the end of their conversation he's like, but you did find that kind of funny, didn't you? Like, you found that humorous. And Rory's like, yes, but that's so not the point here.
I love Bootsy's reaction the most, I think. He's like, there were 2 crimes. Someone got murdered and someone moved the body. It's open and shut. Bing, bang, boom. Anyway, that's not the point here. Back to the fight. What do you think of, who was right? Was Lorelai right to butt in this moment? Or was she overstepping the bounds here?
She definitely overstepped. But I think she, as a friend and as somebody, because they were still, chemistry aside, still friends at this point. As somebody who has known Luke as long as she has, and with the rapport as friends that they've had, I think she did have a right to say something in the context of, look, I'm a parent, I've had a kid, I'm seeing really troubling things with Jess, even after a 5 or 10 minute conversation with him, that I think you should be aware of. If she had just left it at that, I think that would have been appropriate. But I think she embellished too much with just how much she was already sort of hating on Jess and the behavior. And she was right to an extent with a lot of what she was seeing, but she didn't have to go overboard as much as she did with harping on him to Luke. And that's where I think look, I can't talk anymore. Luke took issue, because it's like, no one wants to have to, like, if it's your kid, no one wants to have to hear negative things about your kid. And even in this case, with him just being a nephew, like, no one wants to have to hear that, like, oh, your nephew's troubled and he's dangerous, and he's going down the wrong path, and this is a bad road for him. So I think she overstepped in how far she took it, and how much she carried on with saying, like, he's dangerous, he's bad, like, Luke, you've got to do something about this, you've got to nip this in the butt now, or like, this is just going to get worse for you. And she took it too far, and that's where I think Luke reacted, and why his reaction was understandable, because, like, you've only known Jess for well in this. You've only spoken with him for a few minutes. You never really even don't know him well at all. So who are you to come in and pass this judgment on my nephew when I'm trying to give him a better start here? Like, give him a chance. And it's not your place to tell me how to try and raise my nephew at this point and get him back on track. So I think that even for the years of friendship that they've had together, yes, Lorelai absolutely did overstep.
I tend to agree. And I also think she might have overstepped with what she said to Jess in the first place that elicited his response. I think she took it upon herself, thinking that she knew what was best in the scenario and thinking that her experience with a kid like Rory and maybe even her own experience growing up sort of troubled gave her the right or the skills or the cachet to talk to him and say what she said. And so when she tells Luke what she said, she downplays a little bit and she says, I wanted to tell him he's got a good thing going with you and he shouldn't blow it. But actually what you did was sort of like try to come in and befriend him and act like you know everything. And, you tried to catch some flies with honey instead of vinegar, and it didn't work. It was the wrong tack to take because you don't know this kid. And it's also not your place necessarily to try to talk to him and convince him that this is somehow the right thing for him, even if you think that's the case. And so she's trying to help Luke in that moment, but instead she's just poking the bear, really. And it doesn't help matters any. It just sort of sticks her nose in where it doesn't belong. Like, granted, Luke was underprepared for what he was facing with Jess. I think basically anyone who gets a kid like that is underprepared. I'm like, he's got a lot more going on than anybody seems to realize. Mm-hmm. But Lorelai should have waited for Luke to ask for help. Then again, Luke's not the most communicative guy. He might have waited until it was too late. But it wasn't her place necessarily to just stick her nose in it. She should have been more respectful of his adaptation period with Jess and let them sort of get settled into a dynamic before she tries to insert herself into things. So I don't necessarily blame Luke for being like, like, I don't need you to do that. He's my nephew. I know what I'm doing. Well, you didn't, but okay. But yeah, it was a little bit condescending for Lorelai to just step in thinking that she knows what's best for this kid that she met 5 minutes ago. And Luke was a little bit right to be like, stay out of it. But the rest of it was wrong. The defensiveness and the low blow about her teenage pregnancy, like, respect her 16 years of parenting a little bit more and lean on her. Ask her for wisdom for specific situations. Take it under advisement. Don't be a jerk about it. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But, like, stop butting heads so much. Like, Lorelai, stay out of it until you're asked for help or advice. And Luke, calm down and recognize that you will need help with this. You are not an island on this. You don't have to be an island. But ultimately, this obviously ends in one of the best scenes in the entire show, which is Luke pushing Jess off the bridge.
Agreed.
So, yeah. Eventually, they do kind of resolve it by the end of the episode. It's not always true with every fight. We'll get to that in a sec. But, Luke comes back and is like, I went to confront him and he was being impossible and I just pushed him in a lake. This is bad. Lorelai's like, can he swim? Yeah. He's fine. He's wet. I just lost it. Mm-hmm. I'm in so far over my own head that I can't see my own hat. And then, of course, we have the epic jam hands rant. Yeah. But at least, he does come to see more of what he's going to be dealing with here. And he realizes Lorelai may have had a point. I don't think she went about it the right way, but she had a point.
Mm-hmm. I agree with all of that. And I think that's going to take us right into the aftermath of the car crash.
Oh, some of the best writing and acting thus far in the series. And it only gets better from here.
Mm-hmm. We've said it before. Seasons 1 or 2 are great. It just gets better. So get into season 3, season 4. I mean, watch the whole thing, obviously, but those middle seasons are the chef's kiss of this show.
Mm-hmm.
However, that being said, aftermath of the car crash. Who was right? I'll pose you this question. Who's right, who's wrong? Luke or Lorelai?
This time I think Luke is more right than Lorelai, because Lorelai has this whole head of steam. She has a chance to build it up on the way from the hospital. You know, she plays it cool with Rory, but in this moment she's dealing with intense anxiety, and like, this is any parent's worst nightmare. If this had gone just a little bit differently, Rory could have been a lot more hurt. And so it, regardless of the fact that everyone was okay, it was such a close call, and it was still a really bad situation. And so she gets this opportunity between walking to the hospital and getting back to the diner to get really, really mad. And I almost wish we had seen her take it out on Jess instead of Luke, because I feel like that would have been so engrossing to watch. I get that it's more poignant for her to have that conversation with Luke and to maybe have that sort of buffer and not unload on a 17-year-old kid. But it would have been great to see, just saying. But she was just so worked up, and she had no perspective on it. She hadn't had any time to process or cool down or anything. And she just barges over there and yells at him and blames him for not sending Gus away. And he rightly says, he's my family. I had a responsibility to him. I was trying to do right by him. And you know I love Rory, but like, this is not my fault. And I don't even know what happened. I don't know where Jess is. I don't know if he's okay. And so I'm going to go find him. And if that gets in the way of your yelling, that's just too damn bad. And then she just, I don't know, she unnecessarily blames him and projects on him all these things that are just out of everyone's control. And I don't like that she ascribes fault to him, because she can't even, like, Rory told her, like, it was an accident. It wasn't Jess's fault. Jess was driving, but like, you know, we were just driving around and an animal came out of nowhere. It's not like Jess was speed racing and doing donuts in a parking lot or something. But Lorelai just loses it and has no control over herself. It would have been so much better for everyone. Like, anger never helps the situation. She should have just gone somewhere else, blown off that steam, and dealt with it some other time, because that level of flooded emotion just never results in anything good. So I think Luke was way more correct in this situation, because despite the fact that he got a little worked up in response to Lorelai, he was the one who was able to stay a little bit clearer and say, like, I need to find Jess. I need to see what's up. I need to talk to him. At least you know where Rory is and that she's okay. I need to find Jess. So, yeah, Luke did nothing wrong here. He was just trying to look out for Jess, even with, you know, asking Rory to tutor him in the first place. I think he was unnecessarily the target of Lorelai's misplaced frustration, anger, and frankly hatred for Jess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm gonna bounce off of exactly what you said, because that was gonna be my follow-up point to all of this. Lorelai, not that she was looking for any reason to hate Jess, but if one was put in front of her and she had one to run with, she was gonna take it and run with it. And she got it here with this car crash, where she was already not loving him, the person that he was. Definitely, this was someone that you could already sense that she wanted staying away from Rory. She wasn't loving his character, his personality, which is why I think she was hesitant to have Rory tutor him. Not even because, like, oh, you know, it could take away from Rory's studies and her own time and she needs to do that too. I think that was true, but also an excuse where Lorelai was just, again, like in her mind, like, this is not someone that I want my daughter spending time with. All she needed was a reason to hate Jess and to come down on him and to have an excuse for that hatred and that contention that she was just having build up with inside of her. This car crash happens, and now she has it. And so everything that's been building up inside of her, like you said, she just unleashes onto Luke, and she's like, this is exactly what I was talking about. This is exactly what I was worried about. It came true. I'm right. Your nephew sucks, essentially. He's not a great person. And now look at what's happened. My daughter has been physically injured. Instead of Lorelai, again, counting her blessings necessarily with how much worse it could have been, and your daughter could have been so much more seriously injured, or perhaps even, died. But it was just all about her and Rory, and not about the impact that this was going to have on Jess, on Luke. And she had no regard for Jess's well-being whatsoever. Like, and that's abhorrent. Like, this is still a person. This is still like a teenager at this point. And so for her to, like, I can understand, like, Luke did nothing wrong either here, where he's just like, I've got to go find my nephew. Like, he matters too, whether you think that he does or not. I need to be concerned about his safety and his well-being right now. So yeah, I will give this fully to Luke. And then for them to just, for Lorelai to just be like, well, go to hell. Like, are you kidding me? Like,
are you 5?
Like, Luke, I'm glad he was able to walk away in that moment, because he needed to, whether it was finding Jess or just needing to take time to cool off, because Lorelai was so wrong to get in his face with all of that. And yeah, Luke did nothing wrong here. He was just concerned about his nephew, and very much rightly so.
Yeah. I also think Lorelai was in the wrong because, again, she didn't take time to process it and to, like, really think it through. All she thought of was, like, Rory, hurt, bad, oh my God. Nothing else existed. It was just, a flood of adrenaline that she was running on. And anger is a secondary emotion. So there was something else going on there. There was obviously anxiety, like fear was her primary driver in that moment. And you shouldn't do things when you're operating from fear or anger.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like I said, basically always goes wrong. But if she had taken a little more time to step back and think about it, she would have been like, Rory, why did you let Jess drive the car in the first place? That is your car. You're the one who's insured on it. It's your responsibility to make sure that it's driven responsibly and you're in control of that. Why did you let him drive in the first place? Why were you out? Why did you say, let's keep driving when you should have been at the diner studying? This is your fault. And even Rory recognizes it. She has trouble in the future sometimes accepting her fault in some issues that she has. But in this instance, she's ready to go to bat for Jess and say, like, look, I had a part in this. Don't demonize him because I wasn't just, like, being dragged along by him or something. I was the one who said, turn right. So at least she's the one who recognizes it. But Lorelai still doesn't accept that. In Help Wanted, we see them have this conversation where she's like, it doesn't matter. Like, he hurt you, and I get to hate the guy who hurt you, which is just not the most rational thing that she could do. And I just also wonder, like, you said it. She doesn't need an excuse to hate Jess, but she finds one, and she runs with it all the way because she doesn't like him. But I wonder what would happen if Dean was the one driving the car. The double standard at play with Jess and Dean. She probably would have been like, oh, Dean, you're such a sweet, good kid. This was just an accident. Like, can you see her pounding down the Forrester's door if Dean had been the one to take Rory to get some ice cream and they were just driving around and a possum came out in front of the car? No, exactly. She just wanted an excuse to, like, unload all of this hatred for this poor, misunderstood kid who Rory was trying to be there for. And she wouldn't listen to anyone. She wouldn't listen to even her own daughter and her take on events and what actually happened in that car. And and again, what would happen if the situation was reversed where Rory was driving and Jess broke his wrist? Would Luke have unloaded on her and been like, Lorelai, control your daughter? Like, what just happened? Exactly. So again, this is why I give it to Luke. Lorelai was just completely off base with this entire argument, and this is why it takes so long for them to repair the relationship this time, because in the next episode he goes fishing and is gone for a while, and at least Rory goes to him and is like, is he okay? And are you okay? Like, they have a nice moment together. But Luke and Lorelai avoid each other until basically just before the school year starts and Rory's back from Washington, and the whole Christopher thing happens where Emily tries to stick her nose into that. So it takes a long time to get over this one because it was just that bad on Lorelai's part.
I agree. I think we said everything that we needed to say with that fight. But if you have any thoughts and you're watching this and there's anything that you're thinking of in terms of the car crash fight or even any of the other fights that we've already mentioned, drop us a comment. We'd love to hear about who you think is in the right, who's in the wrong. And if there are any fights that we haven't gotten to that you want us to circle back to, again, we will be doing multiple iterations of Fight Club. But if there is something that we've missed that you want us to talk about, drop us a comment and we'll get back to it.
Yeah, I mean, we don't really talk about There's the Rub, but I feel like we kind of have addressed that elsewhere, and we don't really have time to go fully into it, but that was a really good Rory Dean fight.
That was. There are, I feel like, a lot of, again, fights that we might not get to, but we can always have, like, again, an end to part 4 when we get to Fight Club 4, or even just like a special Fight Club episode where we talk about everything that we didn't get to. But are there any other fights or moments that you want to just very quickly touch on before we wrap this one up?
I mean, we also had the Suki Lorelai fight in Ins and Outs of Ins. God, that's a lot of times to say in one sentence. But we also touched on that one in the female friendship episode. So go back to that for more thoughts. And get the ones on Lane while we're there. I'm sure there are probably some other smaller interactions and conflicts that came up that we didn't touch on. I really just wanted to focus on the ones where it was like, okay, this is kind of like the heart of the relationship here, and this recurring conflict and the things that were kind of the most explosive. And as we go through the seasons, I feel like we get more and more of that. And so we're going to have to be even more selective, unfortunately, about what we talk about, because the situations are going to be so much more involved and interesting to dig into. So this one, I feel like we covered a lot of ground, but didn't really go like too deep into anything. Also because, we've talked about the first 2 seasons in a lot of depth. And so it's been touched on elsewhere. So make sure you go back and check out our other episodes, and you'll start to gather a fuller picture of some of our thoughts on these interactions. But yeah, I'm really excited. Our next Fight Club will be when we talk about season 4. I think I have it slated for when we like after Boom-ish, like right near the end there of the season, something along those lines, because oh boy, that's a good one for fighting. Yeah,
it is that.
So stay tuned, subscribe so that you'll get all the future notifications for more talks about fights on the show.
Yeah, and we're going to constantly break the rule and just keep talking about it.
We've broken Rule 1 and Rule 2 multiple times.
Yeah, it's going to be a pattern. Get used to it, folks. But what have we got coming up next Friday?
Next Friday, we're going from hate to love. More specifically, unrequited love. So those relationships on the show that didn't quite get off the ground, or instances where the feelings were a little uneven or took a long time to finally blossom and bloom. So stay tuned for that. Come back for a discussion on something a little bit lighter, I suppose. This was a pretty contentious episode. Not that we were fighting, but a lot of people were fighting in this episode. But next week, a lot of people are crushing and things aren't working out for them.
Yeah.
Sad but true. Doesn't always go the way you want, folks.
Yeah, that's life sometimes. In the meantime, while you wait for that one to come around, again, just go back and watch some of our old videos. A lot of even, like, we've already mentioned, a lot of the fights that we've talked about are stuff that we've talked about in the past already. So go back and watch those episodes. Female friendships, the Max Medina one. We talk about a lot of those contentions there. And in the meantime, just always do those YouTube things for us. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel. We appreciate all of that support, and it really helps us out. In the meantime, don't talk about Fight Club anymore. Don't break that rule.
Yeah, Chuck Palahniuk's going to come for us.
Yeah, but we don't want him to come for you. So just avoid it. And in that case, if he's not coming for you, it'll mean that you can join us next Friday night for dinner. And we will see you then.
Bye.
Bye.